In Magic the Gathering, Vehicle is an artifact subtype that was originally introduced in 2016. All vehicles are non-creature artifacts that ask you to fulfill some requirement to turn them into creatures, typically only until end of turn. This is most commonly accomplished with crew, which means you can tap any number of creatures, and if their combined power is greater than or equal to the crew value, the vehicle becomes a creature until end of turn. In other words, it's like you're putting someone in the vehicle to pilot it. Typically, a vehicle has way above rate stats for its mana cost. After all, they are only creatures conditionally. But when they have good enough abilities and are easy enough to crew, they can be really, really strong. Smuggler's Copter and Reckoner Bankbuster are probably the two most powerful vehicles ever printed, and also the only two vehicles that have ever been banned. However, most vehicles aren't as good as those two, and there are some that are downright awful. And that's exactly what we're looking at in this video. 10 vehicles that are so bad, they aren't worth playing in limited, 60 card, or 100 card formats. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. At number 10, I've got Gilded Assault Cart. For 1 generic and 2 red mana, it's a 5/1 with Trample and Crew 2, and you can also sacrifice 2 treasures to return Gilded Assault Cart from your graveyard to your hand. One way to evaluate vehicles is to say, how good would this be if it was just a creature straight up? And a 3 mana 5/1 Trampler with this recursive ability would be kind of okay. The low toughness is a problem, but at least the high power means it can hit pretty hard and can't be chump blocked, and it's even recursive. Although the type of recursion it asks for is very specific. Sure, decks have treasure, but how often are you willing to use up treasure to return a 3 mana 5/1 Trampler to your hand? Not very. And that's without even discussing the fact that this has Crew 2, so it won't even be a creature all of the time. And for it to be one, you need to tap down a relatively sizable creature, or 2 1/1s, and that really doesn't seem worth it for a fragile vehicle that is generally only worthwhile on an empty board. And how often do we see those? The one thing Assault Cart has going for it, and the reason I have it this low on the list, is that at least it's a way to sacrifice a bunch of treasure for value from the graveyard, and there are some ways to take advantage of that. But if you're really into sacrificing stuff for value, you'd still like the effect to be more broad than this is, and if you're really into treasure, you could be doing all sorts of busted things rather than playing this really inefficient vehicle. At number 9, I've got Capenna Express. For 3 generic and a green, it's a 6/6 with Crew 3. That's pretty bad. Yeah, a 4 mana 6/6 isn't terrible, but a vanilla 4 mana 6/6 isn't exactly good in today's Magic either. Not with all the efficient removal out there, and this is a lot worse than a 4 mana 6/6 because having to Crew 3 anytime you want to attack or block is pretty challenging. It does let you sacrifice treasure to have it become a creature until end of turn though, which is something. But as with the Assault Cart, giving up a treasure for this effect isn't exactly ideal, even if it does allow for some super narrow combo potential. Because vehicles are relatively new, unlike on most of my MTG top 10s, most of the cards on this list have 17 lands data to further bolster just how bad they are. In addition to the usual EDH rec data and the fact that these cards have never top 8'd anything in 60 card formats. 17lands.com is a website where you can track limited data on Magic Arena, a website I really recommend if you like to play limited. And in new Capenna Limited, the Express put up a win rate of 51.4%. While that might not sound terrible at first, it isn't actually a positive win rate. It would be in the Magic community on the whole, since 50% is what the combined win rate would be in a zero-sum game. However, 17 Lands players are super into limited and tracking their data, so they are better than your average person. And the average 17 Lands win rate for Streets of New Capenna is 55.3%, which means Capenna Express is 3.9% underwater. That might not sound like a ton, but in a game like Magic it really is. And this was a set with a hefty treasure theme, but even there, when you might expect a card like this to be pretty good, it wasn't. Even in the lowest powered format around, Capenna Express really isn't good enough to make the cut. At number 8, it's Thundering Chariot. For 4 generic mana, it's a 3/3 with First Strike, Trample, Haste, and Crew 1. This is perhaps the most efficient vehicle on the list thanks to keywords. A 4 mana 3/3 with that trio of abilities wouldn't be a bad card, but it honestly wouldn't be great either, based on the kind of creatures we get these days. And this is a huge step below that simply by virtue of needing to be crewed, even if the crew cost here is super low. It doesn't help that it's also entirely one-dimensional. All it can do is attack and block, and for a 4-mana card that needs setup, it doesn't even do that especially well. Say what you will about Capenna Express and Gilded Assault Cart, but at least both of those can pull off some interesting stuff with treasure thanks to their abilities. Thundering Chariot can basically never do anything interesting. It's just a very subpar conditional creature. At number 7, it's Skybox Ferry. While the first few vehicles we've seen actually do have decent stats when we consider them as straight-up creatures, that's not really true for most of the remaining cards on the list, and it's definitely not true for Skybox Ferry, which is 5 generic for a 4/4 flyer with crew 2 and cycling for 2 generic. So if this was always a 5-mana 4/4 flyer, it wouldn't be a good card today. But it's even worse because it won't always be a creature, not even close. It's a really good thing it has cycling, because at least that means it can also be thrown away to draw a card, and you're going to want to throw this piece of junk away more often than not. Its limited win rate is also really bad, and remember, that was in Aether Drift, a set with vehicle payoffs galore, and yet this card was underwater by 4.6%, making it a card you should virtually never play. At number 6, I have Burner Rocket, another Aether Drift vehicle. For 1 generic and a red, it's a 3/1 with flash, and when it enters, target creature you control gets +2/+0 and trample until end of turn. So a conditional 2-mana 3/1 is awful, but at least this has an enters trigger, and in this case, I really wouldn't fault anyone for overrating it, because I definitely did in my limited set review for Aether Drift. I saw this thing as feeling a lot like Rimrock Knight, but that comparison ended up not being apt at all, since being a vehicle is such a big downside. Plus, the buff it offers is incredibly meager, and needs a creature to already be pretty good for it to be relevant. So the stat line is bad, and the interest trigger isn't useful very often, and that's what has led to it not seeing significant play anywhere, and even performing poorly in Aether Drift Draft. At number 5, it's the Prima Vista. This legendary vehicle is anything but, and it was the card that gave me the idea to make this list. For 4 generic and a blue, it's a 5/3 flyer. If we stopped there, and this wasn't a vehicle, it wouldn't be a good card. It is a creature that can hit kind of hard in the air for sure, but it's also very vulnerable with only 3 toughness, so it takes very little to take it down, and it's a one-dimensional card. But because it's a vehicle, it's even worse than all of that. It has crew 2, but it can become a creature until end of turn when you fulfill a requirement, but the requirement it asks for is very specific. It needs you to spend 4 or more mana to cast a non-creature spell. So no matter how you slice it, this is a conditional creature that asks for significant setup, no matter which way you turn it into a creature. And when the card's baseline is already quite bad, you really don't want to be dealing with that kind of setup. One funny thing about this card in Limited is that the blue-red 4+ mana deck was one of the best decks in Final Fantasy Limited. And in spite of that, the Prima Vista still has a horrendous win rate. It would have an even worse one if the other cards with this type of payoff weren't so good. Basically, it rides on the coattails of its more successful friends to even end up at the dismal win rate it does have in Limited. At number 4, it's Meldweb Strider. For 4 generic and a blue, it's a 5/5 with vigilance. It enters with an oil counter, and it has crew 3. But it does come with an alternate way to turn it into a creature. You can remove that oil counter to do so until end of turn. So unlike the Prima Vista, it comes with a built-in way to turn it into a creature without having to crew it, but the baseline on the card is still a 5-mana 5/5 vigilance that takes extra work to ever actually add to the board in the long term. Again, even if this was always a 5-mana 5/5 vigilance creature, it wouldn't be a good card. I mean, it'd at least be kind of solid and limited, but the whole vehicle downside has a massive impact on how good this card can ever be. Even in a set with lots of proliferate, like Phyrexia All Will Be One, where you could, in theory, get lots of charge counters on this, it didn't perform well at all, and it's not like it's remotely useful in other formats either. At number 3, it's Dusk Legion Dreadnought, which is 5 generic mana for a 4/6 with vigilance and crew 2. So it's very similar to Meldweb Strider in that they are both somewhat sizable creatures with vigilance, but unlike the Strider, which comes with an oil counter allowing it to animate itself on its own a single time, Dusk Legion Dreadnought always needs you to crew it. Again, if we do the usual exercise of, would this card be remotely good if it was just always a creature, the answer is once again a resounding no. This is one we don't have limited data for, but it was a card you tried to avoid playing in its limited format. At number 2, it's Futurist Sentinel. For 3 generic and a blue, it's a 6/6 with crew 3, and that's it. This one does a decent job on that litmus test I've mentioned multiple times, but obviously it doesn't do amazingly well either, since its absolute ceiling is a super conditional vanilla creature. Crew 3 can be pretty hard to muster, especially if you're spending 4 mana on something like this, and even when this can get going, it isn't anything close to a world beater thanks to a lack of any additional upside. This card also has the distinction of being the worst card on the list in its limited format, with its win rate of 49.5%, which was 6.3% below the average win rate in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, and this was despite the fact that the set had plenty of vehicle and artifact incentives. That said, the blue-white vehicle deck in the format was a huge dud, but that was partly because they printed bad cards like this in an attempt to support it, and obviously, it didn't work out. And at number 1, I have Honeymoon Hearse. For 2 generic and a red, it's a 5/5 trampler, so it's arguably the most efficient vehicle we've seen on this list. But there's a serious problem. This can't be crewed normally, and the only way to get it going is to tap 2 1-tap creatures you control. Most of the time, tapping 2 untapped creatures is going to be more of a cost than something like Crew 3 or 4, since you can often tap only a single creature for that sort of thing. It is true that this gets better when you have lots of tokens and stuff, but the cost of turning this into a creature is still pretty freaking high, and incredibly narrow too. At least with most vehicles, if you have 1 creature in play, there's a chance you can crew them, but Honeymoon Hearse always asks for 2 creatures, and that's a real pain. Much of the time, it'd just be better to attack with your 2 creatures than it would be to turn this into a creature until end of turn. I really wish they'd given this like Crew 4 or something, since then it wouldn't be so incredibly narrow, and it's not like that would have broken this card, it just would have kept it from demanding you always have at least 2 creatures in play to use it. As it stands, it's a terrible card that performs poorly no matter where you play it. So those are my picks for the 10 worst vehicles in Magic. If you want to own any of these cards because maybe you're building a bad card cube or something, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.